So I would love to begin by, there's a mic right at your foot there, so don't hurt yourself. By each of you introducing yourselves, telling us just a little bit about yourself, who you are, kind of a little bit of your background. Can we start with you?
Sure, I'm Jessica Taylor. I'm Vice President of Diversity and Inclusive Development here at Multnomah University, and I am a pastor in the Church of God, been in ministry since I was about 19, and a Portland native.
Thanks, Jessica. Did you turn the lights on really bright?
Just for you, right in that seat, yep.
I'm Dr. Kristen White. I'm here at Multnomah as the Director for the Graduate Counseling Programs, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, so I'm excited to talk about this topic. Thank you, Connie. You're welcome.
And you all got to meet Connie earlier. Anything else you want to say, Connie? No, move on. Okay, yeah, great. Well, we have the opportunity to dialogue with these dynamic individuals. There's a lot of brain power on the stage right now. And I want to start by kind of moving toward what I think is a little bit of an elephant in the room, in the way that religious abuse and religious trauma seems to very often most acutely impact minority populations. Persons of color, persons who might identify as LGBTQ. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about, maybe you could start this, Dr. Taylor. I know you spend a lot of your time thinking about how to make spaces that are open and inclusive. Could you talk a little bit about this unique thing that these minority populations are especially vulnerable to this stuff?
Yeah, I think because of some of the things we saw in your great presentation on the slideshow, there can be a silencing, and there can be a no one else looks like me. No one else necessarily understands my experience. So who do I even tell when something is going on? And I think that when groups are marginalized in one way, there's often a lot of intersections with other ways they can be marginalized or silenced in a community.
And what, in your experience, what do we do as we walk alongside folks who we want to help not experience, or as Connie was talking about, be educated and to be compassionate and to help people heal, especially as we think about people who are often pushed to the margins? What are some things that we can be thinking about as a community to serve those types of folks?
I would say there's two things, and I grew up going to church where I was the only person of color pretty much my entire life until actually the last 2-3 years. That's been a new experience for me, not to be the only in the room. And so I think if people had come and reached out and not assumed that my experience was the same as theirs and asked some questions, they would have very quickly found out I'm having a completely different experience. And the second thing is, then you have to believe me about that experience, even though it's not yours.
Slow us down right there for a second, because I feel like that's a big deal. Can you talk a little bit more about that? You have to believe me, because I feel like so often I find myself doing it. Oh, really? Really? Like, you really feel that way? Like, oh, come on. Like, it's not. They're nice people, you know? I'm sure we've all had those reactions, like, I don't know about that. That seems a little over the top to me. Can you unpack that for us a little?
I think because so much of what can happen in that space where people are being harmed, it's subtle. It's not like someone came up and punched me in the face, right? And so there's no mark a lot of the time. And so I think that piece is difficult for people to understand, again, when they don't share the experience. So it's very timely. Actually, yesterday I got a message from a woman I went to church with my entire life, and she said, 6 years ago, you talked to me about what it was like to be Black in our church, and I did not understand, and I wish I would have responded so different. Because she said, well, you're not Black, you're Jess, right? Like that, why isn't that enough? And we had a beautiful redemptive conversation because she's come really far in her journey of that. But even in my experience sharing, it was like, I just have nothing sticky to understand that by. And then the insults or the things that were really difficult and in my mind pretty covert, they were usually explained away. Well, you know, she's old, or ugh, those kids, there's always a reason behind what was happening. And there usually wasn't enough training in pastoral staff, and I was on pastoral staff, to actually say, I know how to interrupt that. I'm going to do something about that. That's not acceptable for you to experience that. It was more, sorry you experienced that, but it's probably because, that person's ignorant, and you just kind of have to take it.
Yeah.
And then that can further marginalize and say it's not worth disclosing. And so I think that believing, but also being trained up enough to know how to interrupt and support, not blow up and go crazy, because that would make things a little bit worse for me if you did that, but to say, how can I come alongside you? Or how could we interrupt that? How can we make sure that's not your experience?
Yeah, Connie or Dr. White, does anything occur to you as we're talking about this?
This is really obvious, but it seems worth saying is I think another way to interrupt some of this is to name power and to share power, right? And when we do have the power, right, whether it's actually, okay, I'm a director, or it's just I have more money or more status, or I'm the one, I'm look like everybody in the room, or whatever it is, I think to be especially curious about the experience of other people.
When there's a power imbalance, yeah. And isn't that so important in religious contexts too? Because all the world's major religions are set up to put people in positions of power. Whether you're a pastor or a priest or an imam or a rabbi, you are immediately, the power imbalance goes whoop, immediately when you walk into the room. Connie, it looked like you had something you were going to say.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about, is this on? Are we on?
Is Connie's on? There's another one down there. Say check. One of the two. Here, yeah. Try.
Yeah, I'll take this. I want to, yes, piggyback on both of what you said. It's very easy when we're the ones with power to deny that we have the power. And I think about this in the therapy room. I am both a therapist and a client. And I sit with my clients, and a part of me goes, we're just having a conversation. It's just me and them chatting. When I'm a client, it doesn't feel like that. Mm-hmm. It's a very different experience to go, oh my goodness, I'm the one sharing, bearing my soul, and they're listening and just evaluating. And so I use that as a microcosm for a bigger awareness that we often downplay, minimize, or dismiss the power that we actually have. Mm-hmm. And that does a huge disservice to those with less power.
Yeah.
I think that's so relevant. And there is something insidious about power, I think, that the minute we have it, we become blind to it.
Yes.
I have a really good friend who I worked with for years, and he hated conflict. And he would just melt in the face of any kind of conflict, any kind of confrontational conversation. He just hated it, and he would avoid it at all costs. Well, it just so happens this person is very gifted, went on to found a dynamic nonprofit that's now a $20 million nonprofit that he helped start. And so he's like the big boss in the room now. And he was sharing with me a couple of years ago, he was like, Paul, it was crazy. I had to deal with a conflict with one of our employees, and I had to kind of move toward this person. And it was no big deal for me. And like it was not like it was before. Like I didn't get anxious, I didn't get nervous, I didn't want to avoid it. I just moved right toward it, and I felt confident. And he was like sort of bewildered by this change that had happened. And I was like, dude, because you have all the power in that situation. Those stakes were so much lower for you. Could you all talk a little bit about kind of building on what Connie started to talk about? Ways that we can find healing. If you have thoughts or ideas about practices, be they emotional or spiritual practices that can help us find healing, to kind of calm down that limbic brain, to heal that limbic brain and get us more into our prefrontal cortex. Dr. White, I know practices is a big thing for you. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love that topic. Obviously, therapy and spiritual direction, those are great places to start, places to really get honest about your experience, not only in the past, but what you're experiencing now as it gets re-triggered. And therapy with any licensed counselor. I'm not opposed to pastoral counselors, but I don't know if this is maybe the right space for that. So I'd say a licensed counselor in particular, or a spiritual director who maybe has some knowledge and expertise around this area of spiritual trauma and abuse. I think both are great resources. And the other thought that comes to my mind, I'd be really curious actually, Connie, to hear your take on this. I am a spiritual director now as well. I forget that sometimes. And One of the things I love about spiritual direction is just the huge number of ways to approach and connect with God. And I think for people who have experienced religious abuse and trauma, when they're ready, which may not be right away, peeling back and opening some of those options, almost creating a bigger spiritual menu of ways that we can connect, that it doesn't have to look this one particular way at the church. I'm sure everybody's different, needs to be individualized, but I think for a lot of people there might be new ways. You know, maybe the prayer is triggering, but they can go out and sit by the stream and just breathe and feel God's presence, right? So to really open up those ways, I think would be huge. What do you think about that, Connie?
Yeah, I very much. There's so many. I know I can speak to how I was raised in a pretty quite conservative structure religiously, and there were 3 ways to know God. You go to the church, you read your Bible, and you pray. Yeah. And which means talking. Yes, talking exactly, and yes, to broaden that out and redefine the divine, redefine. What is this thing I'm interacting? Who am I interacting with, and how? And is it this narrow and boxed in its options? And I love that broadening that out and saying, what if there were a way to connect with God that is not some traditional ways to do so?
And I would specifically add on that, maybe using our body as a way to pray because of the fact that our body is getting hijacked by the anxiety and the limbic system. And I personally really have discovered and love using my imagination to pray. Did you know that you can do that? I didn't know, right? But you can even read the Gospels and imagine being with Jesus there. And they take on a whole different feel. And it's a totally different way to encounter scripture and prayer and Jesus. So really stretching these boxes.
One of the things that I needed to do for a lot of my healing was therapy. But as a Christian counselor and coach, and this might be controversial, I knew that I needed to find a woman of color who would understand me. And I knew I needed to find a non-Christian, someone that could not be deceived by my high level ability to navigate all these Christian-y things. Because I could deceive, oh, I'm fine, and the Lord, it's a rough season in the wilderness, whatever. She don't care about that. She's not fooled by that. She's like, I don't know what kind of jargon you're using. She doesn't know. And so that was really hard for me because I felt like, oh, that seems so bad to seek advice or counsel or therapy. I needed that so that I could be real, so that I could use language that helped me describe how I was feeling and not worry that I was causing someone to stumble. There was so much wrapped up in everything had this religious trauma to it, including how I thought about my own healing process. And so for me, I actually had to step out like somebody I can't fake it with, who there's no reason to fool her. And then secondarily, I think being in community with other people, because you most likely are not the only one that has experienced that. And I'm not saying, go find people, sniff it out, and start a coup. But there are other people who have experienced what you've experienced, and they've either left or they're still there silently hurting. And I was speaking actually to a former youth student last night and saying, one, I'm sorry for how I perpetuated all of these pieces of harm when I did not see what it was. And also, how are you and your peers? And it was, hey, we got together and we were kind of part of a white supremacist religious cult. And I'm like, yep, for sure we were. For sure we were. But we didn't know. And so just not being gaslit by all the people in that system, but coming outside of the people harmed by that system to say, was that your experience? Was that your... We all had that experience, but kind of had to deconstruct all that by ourselves, coming back into community to say, hey, are you healing? Are you getting help? Are you getting support? And maybe we do that together.
Yeah, there's a reason AA is as successful as it is all across the world.
I think God came up with it first.
Yeah,
But AA
yeah, that's that type of vibe, yeah. On this topic, I want to kind of give a shout out to the people, maybe in the room, the people watching online. One of the great things about EMO is our network is very broad. So we work with Christians and Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and people of no faith at all. And I imagine listening to us right now are people with no faith at all who are kind of going, yeah, you know, I had enough trauma, whatever it was growing up, or the things I saw on TV, or the political climate of the town I grew up in, and I'm just like, I'm kind of meh, you know, like, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Connie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the value of being in that space and what it looks like to, you know, embrace that kind of deconstruction, or whatever kind of buzzword. I'm not a big fan of the word deconstruction. I feel like it's kind of a little buzzy. But if you could talk a little bit about, for the people who are like, I don't know if jumping back into any kind of religious system is where I'm at.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a huge spectrum of people that I work with in this very thing. There are some over here that are still very deeply, I'm trying to find a better word than entrenched, in a unhealthy religious system. And they're over here going, ooh, is this a bad thing? It feels bad, but I don't think it should be bad. And so you've got this over here, and you've got, you know, I have people all throughout who are questioning, and then people who have left, people who have switched faiths, people who are absolutely, utterly uninterested in anything having to do with faith or religion. And I think part of what I love about the culture of EMO is that breadth. The breadth to say, wherever you're at, you're going through what you're going through. And for some people, coming away and shifting ends up being another part of the trauma, actually. That they're traumatized within the system, but having to leave is its own trauma, and that's hard to understand because it's a bit like a domestic violence dynamic. We sit there and we think if a woman's being abused, like, get out, get out, get out. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And everything in the people around us, it's like, well, you just get out. What is not always evident is the massive risk it is for her to leave. And so nobody understands that her, actually, statistically, her danger increases once she leaves this domestic violence situation. And psychologically, the danger also increases because if you're in an insular environment, and all your world is around that organization and that group, and you leave, and it's toxic enough that they're now not supposed to have the same type of relationship with you, the levels of loss and grief are a whole nother level of trauma in leaving it. And so deconstruction, I don't know whether I'm answering your question exactly, Paul, but this whole shifting of faith and leaving, it took me about 2 decades to do it in terms of how I had to reposition because there was so much loss and trauma involved, and so the stakes were so high relationally with people that I cared about. And so I think to paint that picture, to have patience both for those who stay and those who are leaving, and to get what it means. Some people leave and they go, well, that sucked, I'm out, I'm fine. And that's great. That's, in my estimation, a lot more the exception than the rule. It's a very high cost to figure out how to extricate yourself.
Yeah, Dr. White, Dr. Taylor, anything from you on that?
I know when I left my church, when I was going through a therapeutic process, which was really great, and I'm sure my therapist was like, get out, get out, get out. I'm like, I know. But there was also this like, well, God's calling, right? Like you don't just leave if God still has calling on you. And so I think that is something that has a grip on you, but you have to learn to discern, is that God's voice, or is that guilt, or is that fear? Because with that loss, I lost my denomination, my job, my family, a lot of what felt like my calling. so much was gone to leave and transition. And I didn't transition to something else where it was like, let's clap. Yay, you're going to something else and we're sending you out. It was like this silent kind of, you're not useful here anymore. And that piece of, well, when do I go, was really, really painful. And I think as we walk with people, to just let them have their process, that was a beautiful thing about some of my teams, my friends, even my therapist, letting me have that process until I was ready. And then when I was ready, I was ready. And I'm like, this is very painful and very sad, but I'm ready. Those people around me that thought they were loving me sometimes were like, get out, because they love me. But that's not what I needed. I needed them to say, whatever part of this process you're in, I'm with you.
Dr. White?
Just real quick, when I was in college, had a pretty big crisis of faith, as did my brother. And I remember sitting down with our college pastor and just thinking like, oh my gosh, we're really going to tell him and he's going to kick us out, or what's going to happen, right? All the things. And we're really honest, I think my brother was at the point, he's like, I'm not even sure if God's real anymore, like much less the whole Jesus thing. And, really hard, deep questions. And the pastor looked at us and said, cool. Like, I'm not worried at all about you guys. You're asking questions. You're leaning in, right? You're choosing not to just take things at face value. You're choosing not to just numb out. Awesome. Let's lean into that.
The power of non-judgment.
And the beauty of searching.
Yeah, truly. Yeah. What that can do to a person when they don't feel judged. Yeah. And it's hard to do, isn't it? I mean, it's so easy to go into judgment. I do it every day, probably 50 million times a day. I'd like to, just as we wrap up, to maybe take a question or two from the live audience here. I want to make sure we're scratching any itches that you might have while we have this brain trust up on stage here. Is there a question that is just burning in your heart? I got lots more, so no sweat if not. Anybody have a question?
You guys get the advantage now of coming live instead of being home
Yeah.
in your pajamas.
Hi, if you want to stand up and just shout, I'll repeat it so everybody can hear.
I guess I don't know exactly how to frame this as a question.
What, this is going to be hard to repeat, so can you talk into the microphone?
I'm finding myself ongoingly curious and wondering from my own experience about the secular world when it comes to religious trauma and it comes to spiritual harm, because I think the majority of us in this room have had some sort of good experience with the whole church thing, religious thing, spirituality thing, but most of the modern world, well, most of the world period, has had a generalized trauma. Just we're post-Christendom and post the abuses of Christendom, that completely disenfranchises them from spirit, from the belief that anything could be sacred, from anything like that. So I'm not doing a good job in phrasing this as a question, but that's my curiosity.
Thank you. Yeah. Did you all hear that? I think that's another. It's kind of in that theme of this sort of. I appreciate that you said we live in kind of a post-Christian context, and many people aren't thinking this through the same lens. What is this topic of religious trauma? How does this speak to those people, and how can we create space and dialogue so that we don't continue to traumatize? So we're not that voice of judgment or whatever in people's lives. Any thoughts about this?
I love how you even phrased your question as it's a curiosity, and I love what you said about how you were met when you were questioning with someone saying, okay, great, you're asking good questions. I think that that's a really important thing to demonstrate, is that we can ask questions. That's not necessarily a crisis of faith. I think that's a strengthening of my faith, as I ask questions all the time. And as we separate some of those negative experiences and traditions and ways of being in systems and institutions from our really vibrant, beautiful faith. Like you said, sitting by the stream, we've said, well, that's less because you have to be in church on a Sunday at 9 a.m. As we separate that out and say, that's not less, that's experiencing the divine as well. And for me, church is an important experience, and re-entering to that is an important experience. But doing that, like we talked about, with non-judgment of when I'm ready, and some days I'm not ready to be back and I need to step back. So just recognizing that that's a process. And I think inviting other people into that process. I want to know where other people in my life are on their walk without the stress of having to get them or myself to a certain destination that looks right. And I think that I had to give that up, of that certain destination that checks that box is not what I need to be doing. It's the journey with people and experiencing that for myself and other people that hopefully is an invitation to that journey.
Yeah, any other thoughts?
Something comes to mind that I think is related to this, and that is, and it connects with something you were saying about going to a therapist who didn't identify as a Christian. And what I see, healing can come from a lot of places. Some of the first, and this can be therapists, this can be friends, acquaintances, but in somebody who is who's gone through trauma, is coming out of a toxic system, and who is trying to reevaluate their faith, I feel like there's several things that can be helpful. The person who is maybe still in the faith, but non-judgmental, grace-filled, and it's like, go for it, ask your questions. Then the camaraderie of people who've said, oh yeah, I'm kind of freaking out too. I got to get out of here. I don't know what to do. I've been traumatized. I can't process this. That camaraderie of somebody who is in that flux space and processing can be a huge balm. And I think the people, a lot of times, that are just beautiful messengers to people healing are people who don't even understand a toxic religious system. And they just go, oh, that's just weird, and that reflection back is actually very healing, who don't know the lingo, who don't know, like, well, why would they not talk to you now? That is insane. And having this broad spectrum of people in our life to give us those feelings, I think all of them play a role. And those of us raised in conservative circles have been afraid to go, oh, these people over here, they're going to lead me astray, and I can't be talking to people who don't believe in God, and to have them go, oh, that's just screwed up. And it's like, oh, really? It is, isn't it? And it's just really, it's helpful. It's a very healing thing. I think all three of those groups can be really helpful.
I heard you say, too, that there's a lot of people that have not only experienced maybe an exclusive experience of religious trauma, but maybe even inherited it, and that's all they know. And I'm really confident that God's love is bigger than that. So I think we may need to have a lot of patience and a lot of practicing, learning to love well. And it may take decades or generations, but I really think if the church could do that, like actually put God's love on display, there might be some hope.
One quick thought. As I heard you talking, I started thinking a little bit about the wisdom of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I mentioned before. I'm a big fan of the 12 steps. I believe that every person would benefit from going through the 12 steps at some point in their life. And one of the great things about AA is it is an utterly non-judgmental environment. If you've never gone to an AA meeting, if you're an addict or not, find one and go. You'll love it. They're some of the coolest, most non-judgmental. I mean, you can just walk in and be like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing here. And they'll be like, cool, have a seat. It's a great group of people. And they treat this in a way that I think is really brilliant. They often use this phrase, the God of my own understanding. There are a lot of atheists in AA. I was just talking with a friend about this the other day, and they're like, how does that work? You saying things like the God of my own understanding. They don't really care. They know that you're on a journey, and they say, whatever that is, it doesn't matter. Don't let that get in your way. For some, the God of their own understanding is just something bigger than themselves, and that night, it's the group, the circle that you're sitting in, the 15 people in the room. That is the thing bigger than me that is That's the best I can do for the God of my own understanding. So I think we could learn a lot from the drunks in our lives. And I say that in a really loving way, because they get this in a way that most religious people, frankly, don't get it. Because we want answers, we want clear lines, and we want to say, you're in, you're out, this qualifies, this doesn't qualify. And at AA, they're like, whatever. Tell me about your pain. Tell me what you're going through, and I'll be here. Let me be your friend.
They're building wells of life that draw people in instead of fences that keep them out.
Can you say that again?
Imagine
That's really
we could
lovely.
be churches who do that. And I was just talking with someone, this is not mine, but I'm stealing this from other people I can't name right now. I've heard there's 2 ways to keep cattle at home. One is you build fences to keep them in, which is usually what we do in churches. We build a lot of rules about who's in and who's out. And the other is you can build wells and they'll come back to the water.
That's good, isn't it? Any final question before we invite our musicians? Yeah, sir.
So I wanted to ask everyone hearing. Okay. So often folks that have gone through some sort of spiritual trauma or abuse can often want to seek.
Hang on. So for the people watching from home.
Folks that have experienced spiritual abuse, trauma, that want to, or sometimes are even preemptively pushed into seeking reconciliation. And so my question is, often scripture is weaponized. Sometimes it's with the best of intentions, sometimes it's with manipulation. And organizations will have even written into their policies, we hold our community to a Matthew 18 principle, which is often pushing people to go to their very abuser one-on-one type thing in situations that aren't safe, and not even recognizing that power differential there. So I was hoping that maybe each of you could speak into what is a way to faithfully still be faithful to following Scripture, to our spiritual walk, and not doing so in a way that's going to cause further harm and trauma.
Matthew 18. Me and Matthew 18 have a complicated relationship. And not because I think it's wrong, but because, like you said, it's been so abused to say that someone should go to their abuser and think that that's going to necessarily work. I spent a lot of time being at the bottom of the power differential, trying to speak up and reconcile to the top of it. But one of the things that God revealed to me in my process was that I'm commanded as far as it's up to me. I was reconciling. I was holding out my hand. I was saying, can we try to understand each other better? I was making the effort. And I don't think I had to, but I wanted to. I felt like that was faithful action, but it wasn't met. And so at some point, as far as it's up to me, I think that was a big piece for me, is I had to do everything I could to know, hey, that's not about me. That's about an unwillingness to continue to come to the table, or an unwillingness to empathize. And that's painful, but I think that reconciliation word, first of all, means that we were reconciled in the first place. To reconcile. We were not reconciled in the first place. Most of the time, we were not on the same playing field. And there wasn't an acknowledgement of power. That power is made invisible, and even lied about, to say, well, we're brothers and sisters in Christ, so it's all fine. Well, families are messed up too, and they need to talk about their stuff too. So I think what gave me peace in my going was, for several years, I had been on a reconciliation journey, but what I realized is it was between really me and God and my heart, not necessarily between the unwilling parties.
I would love to see us have like a trauma-informed manual for Matthew 18 and some of these other scriptural passages, because they're not wrong, but when we treat it as if it's like a one-time, immediate, flat, one-size-fits-all, then we run into problems, right? So creating safety, right? Safe spaces where people can come and talk about what's happened, and those they come to, whether they have power or not, don't just say, go back, right? But say, even if you think that's the right thing, what would that be like? Does it feel safe? Do you need somebody to go with you? Do you need some time to
process that first. Maybe it's never safe. I don't know, right? It depends on the circumstances. But I think a trauma-informed way where we even use triangles, not for gossip. We talk about triangles in family systems, and where we use those for good to reduce the tension in the system and create safety, and then think about what makes sense now, and what's the timing, and what's the process, and all of those things. So much nuance, but I hope that's making sense, Carlos. You want to add anything, Connie?
Yeah, my initial thought was also, how can you, if there's a power differential, how can you flatten the power differential a little bit? And I do think a lot of times that is bringing someone else. In my experience, 13 years after my abuse, I had the opportunity to meet with one of the elders that had done me horrible wrong. And it wasn't my initiative, and I had my husband and another couple that he knew, and all of those were on my team. all of them were there to keep me safe in that situation, and he was willing to come, knowing the odds were stacked against him, and that was good. That was good by him to be able to do that. But that's what it took for me at that point to balance that power. I need 3 people here in this mix with me while I talk to you about it, and that I think can be part of the trauma informed, and to say, and to push a person to go confront their abuser without that protection is just asking for a massive backfire and re-traumatization.
I want to add to that.
Wait, could you just repeat how long it took to have that conversation too?
13 years,
Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
Yeah, and it was a very unusual situation, but yeah.
I just wanted to add to that you can be oftentimes hearing whispers, people are leaving or someone's unhappy, and we're just going, not my problem, or I didn't know that person. But the more we can look for who might need that person, because in my situation, I didn't have a person. I went to elders, I went to board members, I went to other pastors, I went to parishioners. Again, not spreading things, but saying, hey, can we do this biblically? Hey, can we talk about this? Hey, I'm a staff person here, so I'll go to my headship. Well, what about the district pastor? What about the pastor of the whole thing? No one. And so as you are in religious space, as people go, ask them, is it really because you're moving? Is it really because you found somewhere else? Is there more to the story that you would like to share that hasn't been heard? Because that painful part of just not even being asked, I'm like, well, y'all know it wasn't COVID, and you know I didn't go somewhere. So I was just gone. I was just erased quietly, but no one really asked. And so I think that a lot of times we just kind of let people pass through because we think, oh, that's life. People come and people go, and we're told that from the pulpit as well. But if the Spirit gives you some kind of inkling, go ask, because oftentimes people have a story to tell, and you might be a protector for them.
I love that. Would you all join me in thanking these 3 brilliant women on stage here? I want to invite Chelsea and Carrie to come back up. They have one more song to share with us, then we'll head off into our evening. Have you appreciated this beautiful music tonight? Yeah, really exceptional.